Right, well, good afternoon. Thanks for coming, folks. We are here to talk about the Fed and monetary policy and how the Fed is bankrupting America. And we have really a fabulous panel here with the two congressmen are here and Cathy's here. And so I thought we'd each maybe talk for, about 8 to 10 minutes and give our perspective on what's happening with the Fed and monetary policy and really anything you want to talk about economic. And then we'll open up to discussion and questions. So thanks for coming. Congressman Stutzman is here. Congressman, I know you're from Indiana, and you've been just a hero on fighting the Farm Bill and food stamps and other programs. Can you just give the folks here a little bit more details about your background and then give us your thoughts about monetary policy?
Yes, be glad to. Thank you. Is this on? The light's not on here, but it is on. Yeah, there we go. Well, it's great to be here, and thanks, Steve. It's great to be with Steve. As always, admired Steve's work for a long time, and one of the great economists of our day, and appreciate his input and the impact that he makes on policy, and of course, a great Midwesterner from a farm state, Illinois, right next door to us. Illinois makes Indiana look good every day. Because of what's going on in Illinois is just a real mess, and we got two pictures right there. And
you know what your former governor said about my state when a couple of years ago, Governor Quinn had the biggest tax increase in the history of the state of Illinois, and Mitch Daniels, who was the governor at that time, was asked, what he thought about the tax policies that are happening in Illinois, where they doubled their tax rates. And I'll never forget this. Mitch Daniels said, he said, being a neighboring state to Illinois is like living down the street from The Simpsons. And I just thought that was a great line. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No. Well, I am a farmer by trade. Was actually a fourth-generation family farmer. We raise about 4,000 acres between seed corn, soybeans, organic crops from time to time, and also in the poultry business. And so grew up really watching the Farm Bill and understanding the effects of the Farm Bill on real farmers, and always believed that it actually manipulated markets rather than letting farmers do what farmers should be doing. That's responding to the demand around the world. And farmers in the United States, farmer is the most efficient, most effective, most productive farmer in the world. And the only thing that really stands in the way is the federal government. And so getting involved with the Farm Bill was very natural for me. And but the one thing that bothered me the most, and it happened a couple of weeks ago when the Farm Bill passed and was signed by the president, is that the farmers across the country are leveraged by big spenders in Washington. There's problems with the farm policy, but there's an even greater problem by saying it's a farm bill when 80% of it is the food stamp program. So SNAP is almost $800 billion of a $1 trillion farm bill, and I personally think that is deceptive and is misleading to the American people. And so our effort, and Mick, who was a great advocate when we separated the farm bill in the House of Representatives earlier or last summer, I guess, and we separated it, and actually that's how we got it passed out of the House of Representatives. It went to conference committee between the House and the Senate. And the Farm Bill was the best example of how bad Washington can operate. We passed a bill out of the House at $940 billion over 10 years, and then the Senate had already passed a farm bill that spent about $980 billion. So you think, okay, well, they're going to land somewhere in between. I mean, it's a lot of money no matter which one you look at. They're going to land somewhere in between. Well, they couldn't get anything figured out, so instead we're going to spend $985 billion and spend even more money than what the Senate had planned on to begin with. And so it was just the worst of Washington, and unfortunately, we were not successful, but we set a precedent where we actually had one of the legislative bodies pass a farm bill that was separate, and hopefully, unfortunately, it's going to be 5 years before we do it again unless we get real conservatives in both the House and the Senate that are willing to open it back up and separate farm policy from the food stamp program. So it was, we had some success, but unfortunately we didn't make it across the finish line. But in this time in Washington with too many big spenders, it's tough to do.
So before we turn it over to Mr. Mulvaney, farmers are doing pretty well right now, aren't they? Commodity prices are high. We've got the ethanol program, which is raising the price of corn. So are the people in your district that are farmers, how are they doing?
Well, farmers are doing very well. I mean, agriculture, it's a tough business. We can't control either side of the ledger with your input costs and with commodity prices. But not only has ethanol made a difference for for commodity prices, but exports. Exports are America's #1 product that we export out of this country. And there are so many emerging markets that we could be growing more food for, raising more corn, soybeans, and shipping them out. I was actually just down in South Carolina where at the Charleston port, they're filling containers with soybeans and shipping them overseas for $600 a container, which is cheaper than most truckloads running down the road. So there's great opportunities to ship commodities overseas. That's what we should really be focused on. Even though I come from a corn state, ethanol is I'm very cautious with ethanol because we should really have an all-of-the-above portfolio when it comes to our energy, which that, again, would be one of the best opportunities for us is to focus on energy, even considering what's going on in the Ukraine and with Russia. We should be out there getting the Keystone Pipeline built so we have better opportunities to export energy around the world, and we can also feed greater parts of the world with our ag products if that's what we'd focus on. And again, FDA stands in the middle between farmers and food production across the country and the rest of the world. So there's so much opportunity. Unfortunately, government stands in the way, but farmers have been doing well, and they would continue to do well if we'd have
a free market.
Free market, that's right.
All right, thank you. That was great. Nick Mulvaney is a congressman from the great state of South Carolina. I think, second or third?
Second term.
Second term. He is one of the leading conservatives in Congress, is willing to stand up to the leadership when necessary, which sometimes is often. And I've just gained a great deal of respect for him in his 3 years now in Congress, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Steve. And thanks for having me. We'll go right into it very quickly. The reason Marlin and I are invited to be here is that we're on the Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee on House Financial Services, which gives us some really interesting and unique insights into what goes on inside the Fed. In fact, we're going through this year on the committee the Fed turned 100 in 2014, which gives us an excuse to have a hearing every couple of weeks. So that's what we've been doing. And we also have the very special opportunity twice a year of having the Federal Reserve Chair, no longer the chairman, not the chairwoman. She made it very clear her title is going to be chair, Janet Yellen. And we had her in before the committee about a couple of weeks ago. I want to talk a little bit about what we heard, and then what I think you could read when you look between the lines of what Mrs. Yellen said. And I'd be curious to know what Stephen thinks about this, because I know he knows her better than anybody in the room. The general consensus, I think, about Mrs. Yellen or Chair Yellen is that she's going to continue along the same path. That's the conventional wisdom. Every time you hear about Janet Yellen, it's more of the same. She's Bernanke in a dress, the whole shooting match. And I certainly think that is valid. What does that mean, though, just beyond continuation in at least the near term and probably the midterm of QE? It means a couple different things. It means no rules at all. That we're not only not moving towards a rule-based Fed, we're moving away from a rule-based Fed to essentially a Fed that does whatever it wants without any real guidance. And that's a real shame, by the way. One of the things. If you read about Chair Yellen, one of the things you read about her that's interesting is she was actually the very first person ever to mention the Taylor rule at the Fed meetings. The first person ever. You go back and read the minutes, I think it was the mid-1990s, and she was the one who said, you know what, this Taylor rule really makes a lot of sense, and we should take a look at it. So that was there in her... in sort of her fundamental principles, but certainly she's given us no indication of wanting to further develop the rule and its role within the Fed. You're also, I think, going to see that the guidance will continue to be completely meaningless. The best example that I think we've seen out of the Fed in the last 12 to 18 months was supposedly that the yardstick was going to be unemployment. Ben Bernanke laid it down, said we were going to continue QE until unemployment got to a certain level. We're at the level, and everyone seems to ignore the fact that we're at that unemployment level. Of course, using unemployment as a metric for Fed policy made no sense to. I have an economics degree, and if you know anything about economics, monetary policy cannot influence employment in the long run. Okay, that's accepted. That is orthodoxy. Even Keynesians believe that. Bernanke said that on the record at a hearing that we had over at what was I on? The other committee with Kevin Brady. Joint Economic. We had a Joint Economic said, "What do you think, Chairman Bernanke? Do you think that monetary policy can affect employment in the long run?" He goes, "No, nobody thinks that it does." Yet in the same breath, the Fed was using unemployment as the metric that it was going to supposedly use in guiding its action. So I think you're going to see continued lack of guidance. I think you're also going to see a willingness to blow right through the 2% inflation number. In fact, if you go and you read some of the minutes from the various members of the Fed, the various presidents, what you're going to see is now they might be willing to accept 2.5% inflation. My guess is we let it go longer, you're going to start to hear them talk about accepting 3% on inflation, 3% inflation. Those are the things I think you take away from the first meetings with her. What's the most disturbing part, however, I think, is the role of the Fed and the attitude that Ben Bernanke, who I would claim Ben Bernanke is a friend of mine. I used to represent his family. Ben Bernanke is actually from Dillon, South Carolina. If anybody's ever been to Dillon, if anybody's ever driven to Myrtle Beach down I-95, you've all been through Dillon. There's a very famous place there called Pedro's, south of the border. You see the giant billboards as you drive down. There's literally thousands of them. I had somebody ask me at a Tea Party meeting one time, they said, "Is Ben Bernanke as arrogant with you in person as he is on television?" And I said, "You know, it's sort of hard to be arrogant with me when I know that your first job was at Pedro's, south of the border." And that's where he got his start. So he and I got to be friends. His mom and dad, or at least I think his dad just passed away, lived not too far from me. I spent some time with him outside of the office. And I asked him one time on the record at a budget hearing if he thought he was enabling the government. My suggestion to him was that the zero interest rate policy was making it too easy to borrow money. It was not forcing us to face difficult decisions at the fiscal level. In fact, you heard the president over the course of the last several years say on more than one occasion, we should be borrowing more money now because interest rates are low. This is the right time to borrow money, in his mind, for example, for building infrastructure. And I asked Chairman Bernanke if he thought he was enabling us. And he says, "Mr. Mulvaney, I can see that, and certainly there's a certain risk to that, but really, generally, the Fed is not the problem. Congress is the problem." I happen to agree with that. Okay? I happen to agree with that. I think one of the reasons the Fed can get away with its QE policy is the fact that we're running up these tremendous deficits at the fiscal side. Looking down the road, I don't know if the deficits are going to end, at least willingly. I don't think we have the discipline within the legislative branch, and certainly it doesn't exist in the executive branch, to balance the budget anytime in the near future. This means deficits for a long time and a debt that continues to go up and up and up. In that environment, and the reason I mention it in relationship to the role of the Fed, in that environment, what is the only way to effectively manage the debt? It is to monetize the debt, it's to inflate the debt, to deflate your currency and cause inflation so that you can use inflated dollars to pay off old debts. And that is I think the real long-term concern that I have, is not necessarily the Fed has run amok, that not necessarily the Fed is undermining the stability in the economy, but my long-term concern is that the legislature, Congress, is simply addicted to the money at such a level that we are going to force the Fed into doing things that are damaging to the country. I have no idea how much time that's worth, but I'll sit down.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Quiet.
Cathy is one of the top bloggers in Washington and a kind of rising star in conservative circles in Washington and around the country. Thank you for being here. Can you give people a little bit about your background, and then we'd love your take on this.
Absolutely. So I grew up in Alabama, and I was kind of a middle of the road, normal Republican, and I actually got into Ron Paul around 2006 and started to study the Federal Reserve and its impact on interest rates and things like that. And so I moved to Washington about 2 years ago. I worked for Reason Magazine. I now work for Students for Liberty, a project of theirs called Young Voices.
My son runs Students for Liberty at Northwestern, so.
Oh, wonderful! Yeah.
So you direct.
I work for Young Voices,
Good,
which is a project. So what we do is we try to find other commentators in the free market space, young, we're all under 30, and get their voices heard in the mainstream media because free marketers are not well represented, especially young ones. And then in addition, I blog and commentate at CathyReisenwitz.com about free markets and social issues as well. So can I just go ahead and launch into mine?
Please.
Absolutely, okay.
Yeah.
So I was invited here to speak today about one of my very favorite topics, which is Bitcoin. I've gotten into Bitcoin in the past year or so.
I'm all ears.
I was invited to speak at Cryptocurrency Con two summers ago, and didn't really know what it was. My friend Jeffrey Tucker was like, listen, there's this thing. It's free market money. And I was like, whoa, that's amazing. So I started to look into it. And so, one of the things that Ron Paul really appealed to me about was the idea that, okay, first of all, the idea of currency is extremely important, right? And the currency is essential for free market innovation. Markets are essential. But what we have in the United States right now is a manipulation of markets. And so one thing that really appeals to me about Bitcoin is its ability to help us sidestep the screwing with our currency. And so I want to say, first of all, I really appreciate what these gentlemen are doing as far as trying to counteract what's going on with the Federal Reserve and our currency. But I want to talk about an alternative, something that you and I can do right now to help protect ourselves and the country. So, first of all, what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin, it's more complicated than this, but as a shorthand, I like to say it is a currency built on a protocol. And when people say Bitcoin, they may be talking about one or the other or both. The protocol is extremely exciting. In fact, I think it's more exciting than the particular currency. It has the ability to create what is called smart contracts, which can be used to make property smart, which is going to, I believe, absolutely revolutionize the way that we build and enforce contracts. It's especially exciting for people who are unhappy with the way that that governments build and enforce contracts. But for the purpose of today's discussion, I'm going to focus on the currency aspect of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is decentralized and peer-to-peer. So what that means is no one controls Bitcoin. No one person, no one organization, no one institution, no one. It is completely decentralized. What controls Bitcoin is the protocol. So one of the aspects of having a currency not controlled by people is that inflation is low and set. So one of the things that I actually learned very recently was that inflation rates that are high are also generally variable. And so why does that matter? Well, we all understand how important access to credit is for innovation, for economic growth, so entrepreneurs can begin and build their businesses. Access to credit is absolutely essential. Well, what a high and variable inflation rate does is it disincentivizes lending because it makes it very difficult to predict what the nominal rate of interest is going to be. So having a way to borrow and lend money in Bitcoin with a low and steady interest rate, or any currency where you can depend on the interest rate staying low and steady, is really, really exciting. So how does this interplay with the Federal Reserve? Well, the Congressional Research Service just released a really, well, not just, but a few months ago, released a really, really interesting and well-written report. I would highly recommend everybody look at it on Bitcoin and its impact, potential impact on the Federal Reserve. What they said is widespread adoption of Bitcoin could severely curtail the effectiveness of the Fed's monetary policy. In other words, good luck inflating a currency no one will use. So, one of the things that's really interesting to think about, and what we've kind of talked about a little bit, is what happens when government scoring with currency becomes impossible to ignore. So we've talked about a potential monetization of the debt, which could lead to a potential hyperinflation. So what happened in, like, the Weimar Republic? what people did is they began to buy things with the currency as soon as it came out that they thought would have lasting value. So a diamond is forever, but your marks are for about 5 minutes. In addition, states and cities started issuing their own currency. We can see the problems with both of those approaches right away. It's difficult to obtain diamonds. You don't know what is going to hold its value and at what level it's going to hold its value. It's very difficult to exchange in diamonds. In addition, it's very difficult if you're in one city to buy something in another city if you're using two different currencies. What I predict will happen, or what I would like to see as a realistic alternative, is that when this happens, when government messing with our currency becomes impossible to ignore, people will turn to Bitcoin instead. They'll immediately buy Bitcoin. So why do I think that this is possible, and why do I want it to happen? First of all, Bitcoin is extremely easy to buy and use. Setting up a wallet takes minutes. Learning how to exchange in Bitcoin, it's immediate. You can give someone Bitcoin immediately and feelessly. I mean, imagine that. I could give you money immediately and feelessly. In addition, Bitcoin transactions are by default more secure than credit card transactions. They're irreversible in one step. So what that means is there are no costly and problematic chargebacks, which merchants now have to deal with when they're dealing with transactions, which take up lots and lots of time and energy on the part of the merchant. They also require a lot less information, so there's a lot less information that is available to be taken in a Bitcoin transaction. And also, one thing that's really exciting that we haven't really seen the promise of yet is that Bitcoin enables microtransactions to be possible and feasible and profitable for the first time ever. So what we're seeing, for example, which might interest you, Steve, is that we're now seeing monetization schemes for content that involve micropayments for articles and tipping for authors to try to find a new way to pay for content. So for all these reasons, all these advantages that Bitcoin has, I think that it offers an easy escape hatch to tyrannical monetary regimes. And so this is not just theory. We actually saw this happen in Cyprus. The Cyprus government decided, we have a huge debt, we need to pay it off, so what we're going to do is we're going to confiscate the wealth of all the bank accounts in our country over $10,000. And the people who had those bank accounts said, no, you're not. They took their money out of their bank accounts and put it in Bitcoin. And you actually saw an impact on the price of Bitcoin as a result of this. You had that many people buying that much Bitcoin. So what this means, what I hope this means, is that people won't have to do it. That governments, when they know that people have an attractive, easy escape hatch, that will be the result when they try to mess with the currency, that their actions will be impacted, that they will take that into account when they're deciding what they're going to be doing with citizens and their money. It's going to be very difficult to pretend QE works when people aren't using the dollars they're pumping into circulation. So what's going to happen to the value of Bitcoin? Well, it's impossible to know because it doesn't depend on any government, on any secret organization, on any shadow group. It depends on the users. It's completely open and transparent. Every single interaction on Bitcoin is on an open ledger, a decentralized open ledger. So what I hope happens is that even if people aren't regularly buying things in Bitcoin, that everyone knows how to use it, that everyone opens a wallet, that everyone knows how to buy things, and that every retailer knows how to accept Bitcoin. Some things that are going to need to happen before Bitcoin becomes widely adopted. I think we're going to need basically institutions. We're going to need Bitcoin banks, in other words. We're going to need to find a way to transfer risk from users to merchants for transactions, for fraud, for misunderstandings, those kinds of things. Right now, all the risk is on the user, and I think that that's going to be something that hampers widespread adoption. In addition, I think we're going to need lending institutions, because right now, to borrow Bitcoin, you have to borrow it from an individual, and all the risk, again, is on the individual, so we need to consolidate risk. But one thing that I would absolutely hate to see happen is that we would repeat the same mistakes that we've made with the dollar banking system in Bitcoin. I would hate to see too big to fail. I would hate to see Bitcoin banks gather together, and instead of allowing creative destruction and allowing the market, which has created so much wealth and so much prosperity in every other sector, be stomped when it comes to currency. We've had no innovations in currency prior to Bitcoin for the last hundreds of years. This is really unfortunate. Currency is too important to let stagnate and to be controlled by government. So, for example, you had Mt. Gox, a huge Bitcoin exchange, which failed spectacularly. People lost millions of dollars of wealth. But unfortunately, that's part of creative destruction, and it has to be allowed to happen, because if it's not allowed to happen, then you have what happened with American banking, with the US dollar banking system, where risk is consolidated. And so you truly do get these huge risk-intense institutions which are not allowed to fail, which are bailed out. The purpose of a bank is to transfer risk from individuals to institutions. What we've done in America is we've then transferred the risk back onto individuals in the form of taxation. And those individuals have not been willing participants in taking that risk on. So let's not make those same mistakes when it comes to Bitcoin. Ultimately, I don't know what's going to happen with Bitcoin, the currency. I think it would be a little absurd to say, in a way, that the very first major entrant into the peer-to-peer decentralized currency game is it. I would like to see, again, creative destruction in the cryptocurrency space, more currencies, innovations in currency, better currencies. But regardless, I truly believe that peer-to-peer decentralized currency is the future. I think it's a brilliant innovation. I think it's really important. I think it's really useful. And so I think that if nothing else, I want everyone to have the option of using it. I want everyone to know how to use it. And so the last thing I'll say is a message to the Federal Reserve. Your power to control our destinies through our currency is limited now. Take heed. Thank you.
I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions about Bitcoin. No question about it. I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about the economy generally and how this kind of ties into Federal Reserve policy. Congressman Stutzman talked about the farm economy, which has been doing incredibly well. When I look at the U.S. economy, though, I look at another commodity. And if you look at the U.S. economy over the last 5 years, there has been, if you look at the economy, it's not an exaggeration to say that one industry has carried almost the entire rest of the economy on its back. What industry am I talking about? Oil and gas, right? We are living through the beginning stages, just the very infancy stages of the biggest oil and gas boom in history of this country. It's ironic because in Barack Obama's 8 years in office, he'll have presided over the biggest oil and gas boom in history, and he hates fossil fuels. But if you look at the U.S. economy, I wish I had this chart, but if you look at what's happened with the U.S. economy and take out the oil and gas industry, there's been no growth at all. It's been basically a flat economy. If you look at the oil and gas industry, it's up like this. And so to the extent that we've even had 2% growth, which has been really a pathetic performance over the last 5 years, this, as all of you know, this has been the worst economic recovery we've had since the Great Recession. We wouldn't even be in a recovery at all had it not been for these incredible innovations that we're seeing in oil and gas. And it's happening because of innovation and American ingenuity and American know-how. We are a very resource-rich country. There's no question about it. But we also are by far the most technologically advanced and the most ingenious people, and we're inventors, and we are entrepreneurs. And what entrepreneurs have done to create this new class of shale oil and gas is extraordinary. If I had told you, anybody in this room, including the two congressmen, that 5 or 6 years ago, if I had said, by the year 2020, the United States is going to be energy independent, I don't think you would have thought it would. I would have never thought it would have been possible. I mean, my goodness, just 2-3 years ago, we had a president who said we're running out of oil and natural gas. We're not running out of oil and natural gas. We're running into it. And so you look at these states. If you've never, how many of you in this room have ever been to North Dakota? Raise your hand. About half of you have. I'd never been to North Dakota. Have you been there, Congressman? You got to go. No, seriously, you should go. It is an unbelievable. To go to North Dakota now feels like what it must have been like during the gold rush era in California. Truly, I mean, you go to this little town of Williston, North Dakota. Used to have 6,000 people, wheat farmers. This is the Great Plains. There's not a lot out there. It's damn cold there. Now it is. People are becoming millionaires. The town used to have 5,000 or 6,000 people. They don't know how many people live there now. They think it's 25 or 30,000. When I see bums on the street in Washington, D.C., or when I'm up in New York, I always say, you want a job, go to North Dakota. That's where the jobs are. North Dakota's unemployment rate, by the way, is officially 3%. That's a bald-faced lie. The real unemployment rate in North Dakota is negative. That is to say they have 15,000 unfilled jobs in North Dakota. The left likes to talk a lot about raising the minimum wage. I'll guarantee you in North Dakota, the minimum wage is not a problem. McDonald's workers make $15 an hour in North Dakota because it's booming so much. I mean, the strippers are leaving Las Vegas and they're moving to North Dakota now because they can do so much business. Anyway, the Wall Street Journal said it, all right? If it's in the Wall Street Journal, it has got to be true. Okay, so it's all being done, as you know, because of fracking. Fracking, let me just be very clear on this. To be against fracking is like being against a cure for cancer. This is the biggest new technology that we've seen in this country, arguably, in 30 years. And it is, and by the way, it's not just fracking, it's something called horizontal drilling, where now they can go parallel to the ground, and it's made our drilling operations so much more efficient. And it's just a cool story because it's not just happening in North Dakota, it's happening in Texas, it's happening in Oklahoma. I don't know if you got any energy in South Carolina or Indiana, but it's happening in West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania. California is sitting on $2 trillion of oil and gas. If all we have to do is go after this. And the reason I mention this is it's so pertinent to current events. Because if we look at what's happening in the Ukraine right now, it's all about energy, right? That's what this is all about. It's all about oil and gas resources. And it's an interesting story. 6 years ago, Putin, who I think we all agree is a pretty bad guy, Putin went to the Saudi Arabians and the Iranians and the OPEC countries and said, let's create a cartel in natural gas like OPEC has had in oil for the last 30 years, raise up the price of natural gas from $10 to $20 and we'll all get rich. Something happened in the intervention when they were starting to try to do that, which is the United States invented fracking. We became the biggest natural gas producer in the world. The price of natural gas didn't go up. The price of natural gas went down from about $10 to $12 to about $3. And it just blew away any idea that you could have a cartel in natural gas. Now, the other reason that this, and by the way, this is crippling the Russian economy because their economy is totally based on oil and natural gas and exporting it to the rest of Europe. But we're now starting to export this stuff to Europe in a way that is much cheaper than Russia does. Now, this also has big ramifications, by the way, for our foreign policy, right? If we're exporting this stuff rather than importing it, it means that we don't have to be dependent on countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia and Venezuela that are hostile to the United States. So this is a foreign policy issue as well. It's also an issue because if you look at one of the things that's pretty cool that's happening in America today, despite everything Washington is doing to try to stop it, is there's a manufacturing renaissance going on in this country. Some of the best products in the world now, some of the best cars, the best steel, the best manufactured goods, plastics, chemicals, they are now made in the United States, made in the good old USA. That wasn't true 10 or 20 years ago. 10 or 20 years ago, as you know, we were outsourcing so many of our manufacturing jobs. What's happening now in America is we're insourcing manufacturing jobs. And one of the reasons that's happening is because our power costs are so much lower than they are in Europe and Asia. So, for example, we now pay about 3 or 4, well, the natural gas price has gone up because this is such a cold winter, so we're using a lot of it. But this cold winter, we were paying about $3 or $4 for natural gas. In Australia, in Japan, in China, in Germany, in France, in Italy, and Spain, they're paying close to $10, $12 for natural gas. So that has been a huge benefit to our producers in this country, whether it's manufacturing, transportation sector, high technology, on and on. By the way, one of the kind of cool things about this story, when the president gave his State of the Union, you were both in the audience for that. Remember, he was talking about, well, we're having this big oil and gas boom. He actually tried to take credit for it. But then he said, but we have to transition into these green energies. And, it's an amazing thing. And I'm going to be bipartisan here. Under the last The last energy bill passed by George W. Bush, and then the energy policies of the first 5 years under President Obama, we have spent as a nation $100 billion. $100 billion on green energy. Wind, solar, electric batteries, and those kinds of things. Now, I just want to, I bet the two congressmen know this, but I wonder how many of you in this room know this. If you look at electric power generation in America today, nationwide, anybody want to take a guess at what percentage of our electricity today comes from wind and solar power? Actually, somebody said 1, somebody said 2. No, we're all the way up to 2.4%. 2.4%. After spending $100 billion, we're getting 2.4%. And by the way, there is no way, I mean, look, I'm not against, wind and solar power, although I hate this idea that wind is a new technology. This is an infant industry. I mean, windmills go back to the Middle Ages, right? I mean, this is hardly a new technology. In any case, let's let the free market work in energy. And if you allow that to happen, we're going to be producing a lot of energy from not just gas and oil, but also coal. Now, how does this tie into the broader economy? You all have been talking a little bit about monetary policy. If you look at what we've done over the last 5 years, 6 years, since the Great Recession began in the September, October of 2008, United States of America, what happened in September, October of 2008, if you look at a chart of monetary creation, I know you guys are familiar with this. If you look what happened to the creation of money, the amount of money that the Fed is pumping into the economy, for the previous 20 years, the amount of money the Fed puts in the economy generally grows at the rate of the nominal growth of the economy. And then in 2008, it just goes straight up. You guys have probably seen this. So it's amazing. In September, October of 2008, we doubled the supply of dollars in the economy. It was like we call, when I worked at the Wall Street Journal, we called him Helicopter Ben Bernanke, because it was almost literally like he was stuffing helicopters full of $100 bills and flying over cities and dropping them out of the windows to try to get people to spend and so on. And then on top of that, we've had QE1, QE2, QE3. So QE1 was the purchase of $1 trillion of mortgage-backed securities. Remember all those toxic mortgages that people took out during the heyday? You should be proud to know that those now sit on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve Board, which means that we own them now. They're probably worth, what, about 50 cents on the dollar. And then we bought $1 trillion of Treasury bills, right, 30-year Treasury bills. And now they're buying more mortgage-backed securities, right, to the tune of $60, $70 billion a month. Now, we don't know. I mean, the thing that's interesting about this is we can't really say for certain how this story is going to end, because this has never happened before, right? We've never done this before. I mean, and we're all scratching our head. If I showed you a chart of a country, and their money was growing like this, and then it went straight up in the air, and I didn't tell you what country that was, and I asked you, what do you think is happening in that country? What would you say is happening in that country? Inflation, right? The kind of hyperinflation that you were talking about. But we haven't had hyperinflation in this country. In fact, the CPI and the wholesale prices have been growing at 1.5% to 2%. We've had, I mean, you got to give Ben Bernanke some credit. I mean, I saw him speak a couple of months ago. He said, look, I had a lower inflation rate than any Federal Reserve chairman in the last 40 years. And he's right about that. If you look at the CPI, there's been very little increase in prices. Companies don't have pricing power right now. This is kind of a paradox for us, right? All the record amount of money, but we're not seeing the inflation. And I think we probably all agree that the explanation for that is that it's that four-letter F word, right? Fear. Fear is the overriding sentiment in the economy right now. Consumers aren't spending. Banks aren't lending. Investors aren't investing. It's almost like we're hoarding our money, almost like we're taking all that money that the Fed is putting out there and we're stuffing it under our mattress. Now, here's the danger, though. The danger is that what happens when this economy starts to grow? What happens when people start sticking their toe back in the water and we start to see some normal growth? This economy should be growing at 4 to 5% right now. We're growing at barely 2%. If we had those rates of economic growth, you're going to start seeing inflation start to creep up. You're going to see interest rates rise. And then this gets into the problem that you were talking about, Kathy. I mean, how are we going to finance this debt? We got $16 trillion of outstanding debt. If interest rates just rise to their normal levels of the last 30 years, you're talking about over the next 10 years, $2 to $3 trillion of additional debt just from your higher interest payments. So we are very vulnerable right now to an interest rate shock. And that's why, as a matter of precaution, what I favor is starting to pull this money back as soon as we can and as quickly as we can. Because if we don't do it and we start to see those rising levels of inflation and those rising level of interest rates, then you're right. Then you're going to have these alternative currencies, gold, the euro, or something like the Bitcoin that takes its place. Because the reason you have a currency, what is the purpose of having a currency? It's to be stable, right? It's to retain its value over time. And I worry about what we're doing in the dollar. One last quick point, and then I'll open it to questions. This idea of printing money to get out of an economic crisis, this is nothing new, right? I call this the Argentina, Bolivia, Mexico model, right? That's what these countries have done in the past to get rid of their debt crises. So I gave a speech a couple months ago, and somebody gave me this currency from Zimbabwe, and this is a Zimbabwe bill, and you guys are going to think I'm extremely rich because I have this. $100 trillion. 100. How many zeros there are? I think there's like 14, 15 zeros in that. Anybody want to guess what this thing is worth? About 32 cents. About 32 cents. So it doesn't matter how many zeros you put on your dollar bills. Only people like Paul Krugman believe that inflating your currency creates growth. This is why what you guys are doing on that committee is so important. And the thing that really scared me was when you said there are no rules right now, that essentially the Fed is making it up as they go along. And what I believe in, and I think we all do, is at the very least, let's have some rules so that because you're quite right. What degrades a currency is when you don't know what's going to happen with it, whether it's going to go up or down, and we don't have any idea what the rules are, so you've got investors just guessing what's going to happen. And I think that's very destabilizing. If we could get a rules-based regime, I think it would be highly beneficial for the U.S. economy. So I'm going to stop there. Let's take as many questions as we can. Please don't make long statements, but just questions. And we've got about 15 minutes left, so we'll try to get through as many of them as you can. Shout it out a little bit because the acoustics are not great in here. And we'll start with this gentleman right here.
Yeah, I think
Can you repeat the question because I don't think a lot of people.
I'm going to focus on the first part, which is the likely regulation that Bitcoin is going to face. I think the biggest area that we need to be careful about is the regulation of the exchanges. So what that means is where people are exchanging other forms of currency for Bitcoin, buying and selling Bitcoin. A lot of the things that states have done is they've tried to make the barriers to entry for being a money exchanger extremely high. This is pure cronyism and corporatism. I would hate to see the same thing happen with Bitcoin. I think it would curtail a lot of the tumultuous marketplace, the creative destruction, the competition, and the innovation that you've seen in the currency. We need to see in the exchanges as well. And so we need to be very careful that I understand that people want to not be goxed. They don't want to lose all their money when exchanges fail. That's a huge problem. But we need to have the ability for people to use either established, reputable exchanges or new entrants into the marketplace who are using new methods. That option needs to be available to people, and what regulation does is it takes that option away from people. So that's something that we have to think about. We need to look at the way that Bitcoin is going to be taxed to make sure that it's not that use is not penalized in an effort to give the dollar a monopoly. So those are the biggest areas.
So let me, and I'd like your gentlemen thoughts about this. I'm not an expert on Bitcoin by any means. I don't completely understand it. I don't kind of know how, where it came from. You talked about the protocol. I wanted to ask you about what prevents somebody from saying, "Oh, I have all these Bitcoins," just almost inventing them out of thin air. In other words, let me put it like this. With the United States, with dollar bills that we all have in our pockets, the United States government, the full faith and credit of the United States government stands behind that. And that's one of the reasons anytime there's a crisis anywhere in the world, people rush to dollars because they have confidence in the full faith and credit of the United States government. There's no such guarantee behind a Bitcoin. So why would people have more trust in that than a dollar bill? And I want to actually all three of you to answer that question. But why don't we start with you, Kathy?
Sure, I'll go first. So what Bitcoin has is a decentralized ledger, which means that every single transaction that happens with Bitcoin is verified, oh God, I want to say like 30 times. I mean, many, many times it's verified. And it's also completely open to the public. So anyone with a computer and an internet connection can see every single transaction that happens with Bitcoin. So
what was this thing with
it's completely
this
transparent.
bank said it had $600 million or worth of Bitcoin and it didn't? I mean, what
No,
was
it
that
did.
all
It was
about?
stolen.
Right.
It's essentially what happened to Mt. Gox is essentially a bank robbery, and it doesn't really undermine the credibility of the currency. A bank gets robbed. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the dollar. Mt. Gox got robbed, whether it was internal or external.
Okay.
That's essentially what happened to Mt. Gox.
So do you in Congress view this
Kathy,
as a hostile takeover of the Federal Reserve? I mean, what is your kind of general reaction to this whole phenomenon?
Go ahead.
I mean, Bitcoin is fascinating. I think it shows you a lot of, it goes back to the word you used before, is fear.
Right.
People don't trust the
Right.
federal government right
Right.
now. They don't know if their currency is sound. They don't know what's going to happen with the Federal Reserve exiting. What is the exit? Just an interesting fact is that, with the healthcare sign up right now in Illinois, Illinois was forced to provide a right to carry permit by the judges, by a judge. Illinois was the only state not to have a right to carry permit in the United States, and so now Illinois is finally the 50th state to have a right to carry law. And in Illinois, you have more people signing up for gun permits than you do for the health care.
That's a great story.
In the state of Illinois. So it goes back to fear.
See, there's my state.
That's right. Yeah, it's coming around by the judicial branch, no less. But so Bitcoin, it's digital cash, and I think it originally is designed to bypass third-party transactions. It's obviously unregulated. I mean, I'm trying to learn a little bit more about it myself because but I think it when there is distrust of the system, then this is when there's going to be new currencies, new opportunities where people are going to find a better way, or is there another way? Long way to go. I mean, there's obviously the volatility in the Bitcoin market is still there, and at some point somebody is going to regulate it inside the government or outside of the government, because if a bank is robbed, somebody's going to try to correct it one way or the other. But I don't think that in the long run, Bitcoin in a digital age is probably going to be something that we all have to learn about and understand, and maybe it's going to be in an unregulated environment the currency of choice at some point. So.
A couple of different things to the gentleman's point. There are regulations that are already in place. For example, if you go to buy them, I think the institutions that would sell them to you, the exchanges, have to follow some of the FINRA requirements because it's considered to be know your customer, so you have to. It's not completely anonymous. There are some regulations already in place. We actually asked Janet Yellen in the written questions follow up to last hearing her attitude about Bitcoin, whether or not she thought the Fed had the right to regulate it through the Fed. There's another part of the Fed that does regulations. The Fed does not only monetary policy but regulations. I can't remember what alphabet soup that is. And we haven't heard back yet on that, but we will in the next couple of weeks. But to your question, Steve, about trust, one thing that has been mentioned is that there's a set amount. I can't remember what it is, 21 million or billion. Is it 21 million units between now and 2040. It is a rule. It is a rule-based system where they release a certain number of them every single day, or every single 10 minutes or 15. I can't remember what it is.
Yeah.
They're mined, but that leads to another level of trust, which is there is this openly transparent ledger, not only that you can see, but it's reinforced. And in fact, the reinforcing and the making sure that ledger is accurate is how you create the new one. So it's a sort of a self-insuring program. It's designed to be so transparent, and continue to be transparent, because that's how you actually earn these things, is by reinforcing the transparency of the system. So there's a rule-based system, there's transparency, and there's a certain profit motive, if you will, to keep it transparent.
So why
That's
do
how
we
you build
see,
trust.
not to belabor this point, because I'm just learning about this myself, you know, we talked about what we want in a currency is stability, but all you've seen in Bitcoin so far is these wild fluctuations in price.
That's on the demand side, not the supply side.
Right.
It's entirely on the demand side. To her point about what happened in Cyprus, that was all demand, not supply.
Okay. All right.
It's regulated by the market. Can I make one small
Let-
point?
okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah. I just want to get as many. Go ahead.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, you talked about the FINRA, and I want to take a moment to talk about money laundering laws. I think that we need to be very careful that we don't let what we've done with the dollar and money laundering laws happen with Bitcoin. HSBC was laundering millions and millions of dollars for absolute criminals. They walked with no criminal charges whatsoever and a tiny little fine. Charlie Shrem may have been involved in laundering about $1 million worth of Bitcoin. He's in custody. Well, he's under house arrest right now. We have a system where money laundering laws are very selectively enforced. They have very questionable utility. They basically operate under the idea that you owe it to the government to tell them where your money comes from. And so I think that it is a terrible idea to apply these laws and to use these laws to prosecute Bitcoin entrepreneurs.
Can you stand up and shout it out, because we really can't hear that well?